Hello and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we are finally going to talk about the actual Civil War itself, 1861 to 1865. Here are your learning targets. We're going to talk about the advantages that each side had in the Civil War, particularly the North. The second one's the biggie. We're going to analyze the impact of the Civil War on the North and South and talk about the major battles, including the Emancipation Proclamation being made. And then finally, we'll talk about the effects and the outcome of the Civil War. So let's get started. If the war was going to be fought by sheer strength, the North has a clear advantage. We have the larger population, we being the North, since Indiana is a northern state. The North has the larger population. They have mechanized factories compared to the farms in the South. They have more railroad track. We have well-developed mines for supplies and a well-organized navy, as well as the South has to start from scratch, basically. And basically, the advantages for the North are the disadvantages for the Union. They have basically, the advantages for the North are the disadvantages for the South. They have a smaller population, less manufacturing, fewer railroads than the North. You might say, well, what do railroads matter? Well, it's how they ship supplies. And the North actually has to use the South's railroads to ship supplies there, and that impedes them. They can start blowing up railroads and destroy shipping lanes. And the South actually has no navy because they're starting from scratch. But the advantages for the South is they're fighting in familiar territory. They know the terrain, and that's a big advantage. They're fighting a defensive battle. They just have to outlast the North. They have strong military leaders like Robert E. Lee, a lot of the great generals trained in the South, and so they sympathize with the South and become part of the Confederacy. And they have troops that are committed to a cause that they believe in, whereas the disadvantages for the North are the opposite of the advantages of the South. They have troops, and there's less commitment to preserving the Union. Their military leaders are less experienced. They're battling in unfamiliar territory, and like I said before, they have long supply lines to get their things to the South. Look at our resources here. The blue is the Union, and the gray is the Confederacy. We outrank them in population, railroad track, wheat production, merchant ship tonnage, naval ship tonnage, iron production, firearms production, but the one thing that the South does have, more cotton. Better uniforms, and that probably comes into play. You know, if you have cotton uniforms, they're probably cooler, cheaper. I'm just kidding. Cotton production, but the South does have a clear advantage at 24-1 to the Union. Our war strategies, you can put this in number 1 as well. The North, theirs is called the Anaconda Plan. And basically, like a snake, they want to strangle the South into submission. They want to seize the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico so the South cannot receive or send shipments. And basically, they'll starve themselves into submission. And the South's strategy is just to survive and outlast the North. Once they get tired of fighting, it's over, and the South wins. As we already talked about from our last lesson, the Battle of Fort Sumter is the first attack, and then we go to war. P.T. Beauregard opens fire on the fort, forcing its surrender, and Lincoln then calls for 75,000 Union volunteers for about 2 months' service, and instead, more states secede as well because they see that the Union is serious about a war. The first Battle of Bull Run is the first actual battle of the war, and it was a disaster for the North. Against his better judgment, General Winfield Scott ordered the poorly trained Union troops to advance against the Confederate forces gathered at Manassas Junction, Virginia, and they attacked the enemy position near Bull Run Creek on July 21st, 1861, and seemed on their way to victory until 9,000 Confederate reinforcements arrived. This is after Confederate General Thomas J. Jackson had earned the nickname Stonewall for holding the line against the Northern assault. The augmented Southern Army counterattacked and routed the invading force. As they retreated towards Washington, the raw Union troops gave in to panic and broke ranks and started just running back to Washington, D.C. It was a humiliating defeat for the North. There were a lot of casualties during this battle, and it was very brutal. Both sides had not known how brutal it was going to be. It's urban legend that some people had actually come out to the hill to watch the battle. But in what they saw, they did not see glorious battle. They saw people dying right in front of them. And the South calls this the First Battle of Manassas, but we call it the First Battle of Bull Run. And that is a victory for the Confederates, which a lot of these early battles are. Battle of Antietam was the single bloodiest day in American history, with 23,000 casualties in just 12 hours, and this is in 1862. It's a Union victory because 2 Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's battle plans. Here are some statistics for the Battle of Antietam and how many casualties were involved in the morning, the midday, and the afternoon. So in July, Lincoln drafted an Emancipation Proclamation and read it to his cabinet, but he was persuaded by his Secretary of State not to issue it until the North had won a victory and could not be accused of acting out of desperation. So later in the summer, Lincoln responded publicly to critics of his cautious policy, indicating that he would take any action in regard to slavery that would further the Union cause, because that's his ultimate goal, is keeping the Union together. So finally, on September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. And this was after the Battle of Antietam. But the president was also responding to growing political pressure. This Emancipation Proclamation gave the Confederate States 100 days to give up the struggle without losing their slaves. So there was little chance of them doing so. But we offered them the chance, and Lincoln left the door open for a more conservative and peaceful way of ending slavery than sudden emancipation with arms. In December, Lincoln proposed to Congress that it approve a series of constitutional amendments providing for the gradual compensated emancipation and colonization. Since there was no response from the South, now let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. So at the beginning of the war, the North hoped for a quick and easy victory, and only really strong, dedicated abolitionists thought it was being fought over slavery. Congress actually passed a resolution saying the official reason we're fighting the war is to keep the Union together. Lincoln didn't even want to commit his administration to immediate emancipation. He thinks freedom for blacks is the ultimate goal, but it needs to be done gradually. And we can't go ahead and do it immediately because, remember, we still have slave states as a part of the Union. So they can't alienate those states by taking away their slaves, because then we'll lose 5 more states to the Confederacy. So on September 22nd, 1862, after a victory, so they can't say that the North was acting out of desperation, he issues his Emancipation Proclamation, and he gives 100 days for the South to give up the struggle, basically till the end of the year. There was little chance they would do so, but in offering them the chance, Lincoln left the door open for a more conservative and peaceful way of ending slavery. In December, Lincoln then basically says that all slaves are free in areas that are still in rebellion. This does not apply to slave states or areas under Union control. Now, after the Emancipation Proclamation took place in 1863, the Union Army starts accepting free blacks and newly freed slaves who want to join the Army. But slaves in the Confederacy did have their advantages. They did run and desert their plantations if the Union Army was close enough to offer them safe haven, and they also acted as spies and scouts for the Union. Some problems that arise after this are with the draft, people start to riot in New York in 1863 because it wasn't fair. In the Civil War draft, the rich could actually send a slave in their stead, or they could pay their way out of it. And that's really not fair to the poor, and these poor immigrants who had to serve riot in New York in 1863. Also, Lincoln declared martial law, so the military could arrest people who they suspected of harboring Confederate soldiers or aiding Confederate soldiers. He also suspended habeas corpus, which is a constitutional right saying that people can now... Habeas corpus is that you get to go before a judge and hear why you are in jail. It's a constitutional right. It's in the original Constitution. It's not even an amendment. So Lincoln suspending this is very controversial. He claims he can do it because they're in a state of war, but it's still very controversial that he did that. In the South, the battles are destroying the South's land. So that leads to food shortages, rioting, looting, inflation on a lot of things, or price increases because they don't have a stable economy. And so problems are arising for both the North and the South, but the South is taking the brunt of it. Social change. Although a few women supposedly did cut their hair and join the war effort, most women tended to wounded soldiers in newly set up field hospitals. These were very dirty places. Most soldiers died of infection and not just being killed in battle. Teachers in the North went to the newly freed areas of the South to begin teaching these newly freed slaves and getting them an education. Confederate women, while the men were off at war, began harvesting crops for the war, and churches on both sides supported the war effort. By early 1863, the Confederate economy is in shambles. Its diplomacy had collapsed, and it's not looking good for the Confederacy. And the Battle of Gettysburg is the turning point of the war. You might want to make a note of that. It destroys 1/3 of General Lee's forces. It's the last major attack by the Confederates. They never fight on Union soil again after the Battle of Gettysburg. And a few months later, at the dedication of the cemetery at the battlefield, Lincoln gives his famous Gettysburg Address that starts out 77 years ago, and it basically reaffirmed what the Union was fighting for. Also, with the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, on the other side of the country, the Anaconda Plan splits the Confederacy into two, and Grant's new strategy is now to crush Confederate troops. Even if it means Union soldiers are being killed, we want to start ending this war in mid-1863. And he takes up a strategy called total war, which is destroying both military and civilian targets. Before, you left civilians alone. They weren't a part of the war. Now the Civil War is a total war, and it starts to demoralize the South. And like I said before, at the siege and the Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi, the Union gains control of the Mississippi River and stops Confederate shipping and basically starts to strangle the South with its Anaconda Plan. General Sherman then takes his 60,000 troops and uses total war through Georgia and South Carolina on his march to the sea. They destroy railroads, factories, materials, crops, military targets, civilian houses. It's really a ruthless form of warfare. But the point is, it's to break the people's will to continue fighting. And the North had an uphill battle as far as that went. As soon as the Union troops capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, and that was made possible by Lee's retreat from Petersburg because he knows he can't win, On April 9th, 1865, at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Lee surrenders to Grant. And it was actually in the same living room of the guy who used to own the house where the war started. And that's a true story. So, in number 3, what are the lasting impacts of the war? It is the start of modern warfare. People who lived in the South for generations and families that lived there for generations have nothing left there for them. The South is in shambles. And so they drift north in search of new lives, and other people move out west, which is what we're going to be spending next chapter on. Slavery is finally abolished with the passing of the 13th Amendment, and if you saw the movie Lincoln, you got to see a great portrayal of what that was about. And there's an overall view that people start to see themselves as citizens of the United States and not just one state. We are a nation together. And one more thing is that the war definitely decided the federal government is supreme over the states. Remember, this war was being fought over states' rights, and the federal government has a broad grant of constitutional authority to act on matters affecting the general welfare, which is in our Constitution's preamble. And here are just some statistics from the Civil War. You can see the Union lost 360,000 people, the Confederacy 260,000 people, and that was 2% of the population at the time. And you can see the deaths of the Civil War make up half of American deaths in all wars. And finally, more effects of the Civil War. There's an economic boom in the North that we'll talk about. The federal government is now supreme over the states. We become more intertwined as a nation. We're not separated into North and South. Slavery is over. Many people are now homeless. The southern landscape is in shambles. And more than 600,000 are dead, and hundreds of thousands are maimed or missing limbs, and their lives will be forever changed. So that is our overview of the Civil War. Make sure you got everything down. A lot of the test is going to be over this section, and next time we will talk about bringing the nation back together in the 15-year era known as Reconstruction. Also, the economic costs of the Civil War, $6.1 billion in 1860s money. Confederate costs $2 billion. Inflation was 9,000%. Many southern farms, factories, and railroads were destroyed, and we're going to have to rebuild the South when we bring them back into the Union.